Welcome, dear listeners, to Death in Sparrowfield Lane, a Miss Marple Killer Mystery. Settle into your favorite armchair with a cup of tea as we journey to the quaint English village of St. Mary Mead in the 1950s. Here, amidst blooming gardens and gossiping neighbors, our sharp-eyed Miss Jane Marple unravels a puzzling tale of deceit and hidden motives. This cozy mystery, inspired by the timeless works of Agatha Christie, promises intellectual twists, charming characters, and a satisfying resolution, all without a drop of gore. Our story unfolds over 10 chapters, perfect for a relaxing evening. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Shadow on Sparrowfield Lane. In the heart of St. Mary Mead, where the seasons turned with the gentle predictability of a well-wound clock, the autumn of 1952 draped the village in hues of amber and gold. The hedgerows along Sparrowfield Lane, a quaint thoroughfare lined with ivy-clad cottages, whispered secrets to the crisp breeze, while the distant chime of St. Mary's church bells marked the hours with comforting regularity. It was a place where neighbors exchanged pleasantries over garden fences, where gossip bloomed like the roses in Colonel Bantry's prized beds, and where life, for the most part, unfolded with the serene rhythm of a pastoral painting. Miss Jane Marple, a spinster of 74, whose unassuming demeanor belied a mind sharper than the thorns of those very roses, sat in her modest cottage at the lane's end. Her parlor, adorned with lace doilies and a faded Persian rug, was a haven of quiet order. A crackling fire warmed the room, casting flickering shadows across the walls, while her nimble fingers worked a pair of knitting needles, crafting a scarf in intricate cable patterns. Through the lace-curtained window, she observed the world with eyes as bright and discerning as a hawk's, though softened by a twinkle of kindly curiosity. To the villagers, she was merely old Miss Marple, fond of her garden and her tea. To those who knew her better, she was a scream, sharp, raw, and unmistakably female, echoed from the direction of Colonel Arthur Bantry's cottage, a sturdy stone house at the far end of the lane. The sound hung in the air, silencing the chatter of sparrows and sending a ripple of unease through the village. Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate calm, her knitting needles pausing mid-stitch. "Dear me," she murmured, rising from her armchair with the aid of her ebony walking stick. "That does not bode well." The scream had come from the Bantry residence, a place as familiar to Miss Marple as her own garden. Colonel Bantry, a retired military man with a penchant for blustery tales of his days in India, was a pillar of the community, if a trifle pompous. His wife, Dolly, was a warm, if somewhat scatterbrained friend, who shared Miss Marple's love of gossip and gardening. The couple's home, with its neatly trimmed hedges and prize-winning roses, was a hub of village life, often hosting committee meetings or impromptu teas. For such a cry to erupt from their doorstep was as unthinkable as rain on fete day. Miss Marple donned her woolen shawl and stepped outside, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel path. The lane was already alive with curious neighbors, their faces a mix of concern and excitement. Mrs. Price, her apron dusted with flour, stood wringing her hands, while young Elsie, the Bantry's maid, hovered near the gate, her eyes wide with panic. Mr. Hodges had abandoned his wheelbarrow, and even the vicar, Mr. Clement, had emerged from the church, his clerical collar askew. "What's happened?" Miss Marple asked, her voice gentle but firm, as she approached Dolly Bantry, who stood trembling at the cottage door. "Oh, Jane," Dolly cried, her round face pale beneath her floral hat. "It's Arthur. He's dead." The words struck like a thunderclap. Miss Marple took Dolly's arm, guiding her to a wicker chair on the porch. There, my dear," she soothed, her tone as comforting as a warm quilt. "Tell me everything, from the beginning." As Dolly struggled to compose herself, complained of a bitter taste, then collapsed, his face contorted in pain. By the time Dr. Haydock arrived, summoned by a frantic Elsie, the colonel was beyond help. "Poison," Dr. Haydock pronounced grimly, emerging from the study. A wiry man with a no-nonsense demeanor, he adjusted his glasses and addressed Inspector Slack. "Arsenic, I'd wager, based on the symptoms. Convulsions, nausea, and the rapid onset. We'll need a proper autopsy, but the signs are clear." "Poison!" gasped Mrs. Price, her hand flying to her mouth. "In St. Mary Mead." "Murder, more like," muttered Mr. Hodges, earning a sharp glance from the inspector. Miss Marple, standing quietly to one side, observed the scene with her usual unobtrusive attention. The study, visible through the open door, was a masculine sanctuary of polished wood and leather-bound books. The colonel's desk bore a half-finished letter, an inkwell, and the silver sugar bowl, its intricate engravings glinting in the sunlight. A teacup lay shattered on the floor, its contents staining the rug. The room smelled faintly of bergamot and something sharper, bitter, almost metallic. Dolly, still shaken, invited Miss Marple inside. "Jane, you must help," she pleaded as they settled in the drawing room, away from the crowd. "Arthur had no enemies, none that I knew. Who would do this?" Miss Marple patted her friend's hand, her eyes scanning the room. "People often hide their true feelings, Dolly. A village is like a tapestry, beautiful on the surface, but with threads knotted beneath. Now, who was here this morning?" Dolly recounted the visitors. Raymond West, Miss Marple's own nephew, had stopped by to discuss a novel he was writing, one involving a poisoner's clever ruse. "Purely fictional, of course," Dolly added quickly. Then came Mrs. Eleanor Price, who'd brought a batch of scones for the fete, but left in a huff after the colonel criticized their texture. Vicar Clement had visited to borrow a rose clipping for his... "We'll find the source." "Of course, Inspector," she replied mildly. "But do observe the little things. They often tell the loudest stories." As the crowd dispersed and the coroner's van arrived, Miss Marple lingered by the gate, her eyes tracing the lane. A single rose petal, vivid crimson, lay crushed on the path, as if dropped in haste. She bent to retrieve it, her fingers brushing the soft earth. "Curious," she murmured, tucking it into her pocket. The sun sank lower, casting Sparrowfield Lane in a golden glow. But a shadow had fallen over St. Mary Mead. A mystery had taken root, and Miss Marple, with her quiet wisdom and unerring instinct, knew it would require all her skill to unravel it. The village, for all its charm, held secrets as deep as the roots of its ancient oaks, and she was determined to bring them to light. Chapter 2. Whispers Among the Roses. The morning after Colonel Bantry's shocking death, St. Mary Mead awoke to a village transformed. Sparrowfield Lane, usually a cheerful ribbon of cobblestones and blooming gardens, seemed to hold its breath, as if the very air carried the weight of suspicion. The church bells tolled with a mournful cadence, and neighbors exchanged hushed words over garden gates, their eyes darting toward the Bantry cottage where a constable stood guard, his presence a stark reminder of the tragedy. Miss Jane Marple, undeterred by the chill in the autumn air, set out early for her daily walk. Her sensible shoes tapped rhythmically on the path, her ebony walking stick a steady companion. Clad in a tweed coat and a lavender scarf, her own handiwork, she appeared the picture of an elderly spinster, her fluffy white hair tucked neatly beneath a modest hat. Yet her blue eyes, sharp and inquisitive, missed nothing. The flutter of a curtain in Mrs. Price's bakery, the hurried stride of a delivery boy, the faint scent of roses lingering on the breeze. To Miss Marple, the world was a tapestry of details, each thread a potential clue to the puzzle that now consumed St. Mary Mead. Her destination was the Bantry cottage, where steaming teapot. I haven't slept a wink. The thought of Arthur poisoned in his own home. Her voice broke and she dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. There, my dear," Miss Marple said, settling into a cushioned chair. "A cup of tea will steady us both. Now tell me everything about yesterday morning. Leave nothing out, however small." Dolly poured the tea, her hands trembling slightly. "It was such an ordinary day, Jane. Arthur was up early, tending his roses before breakfast. He was so proud of them, you know, planning to enter the fêtes competition again. Then the visitors came, one after another, and by 11 he was gone." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes never leaving Dolly's face. "The visitors, Dolly. Start there. Who came to see Arthur?" Dolly recounted the morning with as much clarity as her grief allowed. First was Raymond West, Miss Marple's nephew, a young writer with a flair for the dramatic. He'd arrived around 9, eager to discuss a novel he was plotting, one involving a cunning poisoner who used everyday items to deadly effect. He was so animated, Dolly said, going on about arsenic and how it could be hidden in plain sight. Arthur humored him, but I could tell he thought it a bit morbid. Miss Marple's lips twitched in a faint smile. Raymond, with his literary enthusiasms, often spun tales that outstripped reality, but his choice of subject was curious. "And then?" she prompted. Mrs. Price came next, with a basket of scones for the fete stall. She's been baking for weeks, hoping to win the blue ribbon this year. But Arthur, oh, he was in one of his moods. He tasted a scone and called it dry as desert sand. You should have seen Eleanor's face. She turned red as a beet and stormed off, muttering about ingratitude. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Mrs. Eleanor Price, the village baker, was a proud woman, her bakery a cornerstone of St. Mary Mead's social life. A public slight could sting deeply, especially with the fete looming. Anyone else? Habits and guarded words was not one to show unease lightly. A will, especially one recently altered, could stir all manner of motives. And the tea itself? Who prepared it? Elsie, our maid, Dolly said. She's been with us for years, Jane. I can't imagine her doing anything wrong. She brewed the tea as always, and Arthur added sugar from his silver bowl. He was so particular about that bowl. A gift from an Indian prince, he said. He stirred in 2 lumps, just like every morning. Miss Marple set her cup down, her mind turning over the details. The silver sugar bowl, with its intricate engravings, was a striking object. Had the poison been in the sugar, as Inspector Slack suspected? Or was there another vector? The cup, the spoon, perhaps even the tea leaves. She recalled a case from her youth, when a seemingly innocent teapot had concealed a deadly secret. As they spoke, Inspector Slack himself appeared at the door, his heavy footsteps announcing his arrival. "Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat with grudging courtesy. "I've got men testing the sugar bowl and cup. Arsenic's a nasty business, but we'll find the source. Any ideas, Miss Marple?" His tone held a trace of skepticism, as if an elderly spinster could hardly contribute to police work. "Ideas, Inspector?" Miss Marple replied mildly, her eyes twinkling. "Only that human nature is often revealed in the smallest actions. Who had access to the study, for instance? Or who might have lingered near the sugar bowl?" Slack grunted, jotting a note. "The maid, Elsie, handled the tea tray. She's our first stop. But I'll be questioning everyone who was here." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her voice as soothing as chamomile. "Do keep an eye on the little things, Inspector. They often speak louder than the obvious." After he left, Miss Marple and Dolly stepped into the study, where the air still held the faint bitterness of spilled tea. The room was as the Colonel had left it. A sturdy oak desk, a leather armchair, shelves lined with military histories and gardening journals. Fate planning. The vicar, Mrs. Price, even Raymond, they all helped set up stalls. As they returned to the drawing room, Miss Marple's mind was already at work, piecing together the fragments. Raymond, with his talk of poisons, Mrs. Price, stung by criticism, Vicar Clement, with his roses and possible grudges, and Mr. Finch, guarding secrets of the will. Each had opportunity, perhaps motive, but the key, she sensed, lay in the ordinary. The sugar bowl, the tea, the petals she'd found yesterday. Outside, the village was stirring back to life. Children laughed as they practiced for the fête sack race, and the scent of baking bread drifted from the bakery. Yet, beneath the surface, whispers of suspicion grew, like weeds in a garden. Miss Marple paused at the gate, her eyes scanning the lane. A figure hurried past, Mrs. Price, her basket swinging, her face set in a scowl. Across the way, Vicar Clement emerged from the church, his hands dusted with soil from his greenhouse. "Human nature," Miss Marple murmured, tucking her knitting into her bag. "It's always the same, whether in St. Mary Mead or Calcutta." As she made her way home, the rose petal in her pocket seemed to weigh heavier, a silent clue to the darkness that had crept into Sparrowfield Lane. The fête would go on, but so would her quiet investigation, unraveling the threads one stitch at a time. Chapter 3. Tea and Telltale Signs. The sun climbed higher over St. Mary Mead, bathing Sparrowfield Lane in a golden light that belied the shadow cast by Colonel Bantry's death. The village, though bustling with preparations for the imminent fête, carried an undercurrent of unease, like a melody played in a minor key. Whispers of poison and murder darted from cottage to cottage, as neighbors speculated over garden fences and in the queue at Mr. Hodge's grocery. Yet life, as it does in such places, pressed on. Children polished apples for the fête's games, and the scent of lavender and freshly turned earth mingled in the crisp autumn air. Miss Jane Marple, ever the unobtrusive and its rose garden, where a constable still lingered, his notebook open. A fire crackled in the hearth, and the air carried the soothing scent of lavender from a sachet tucked among the cushions. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles, her white hair catching the light like a halo, and checked the teapot, a sturdy Wedgwood piece, free of any sinister contents, she noted with a wry smile. The first to arrive was Raymond West, her nephew, whose lanky frame and eager expression filled the doorway. At 28, he was a writer of some promise. though his modern ideas often clashed with the village's traditional charm. "Aunt Jane, this is positively thrilling," he exclaimed, settling into a chair with a notebook in hand. "A real murder, right here in St. Mary Mead. It's like one of my stories. Poison, suspects, a quiet village hiding dark secrets." His eyes gleamed, but his fingers fidgeted with his pen, betraying a nervous energy. "Thrilling is not the word I'd choose, dear," Miss Marple replied, pouring him tea. "A man is dead and poor Dolly is heartbroken. But, tell me, what did you and the Colonel discuss yesterday?" Raymond shrugged, sipping his tea. "Just my novel. I was plotting a scene where a poisoner uses a household item, say, a sugar bowl, to hide arsenic. Pure coincidence, of course." He laughed, but it sounded forced, and Miss Marple noted the way his gaze flickered to the window. Next came Mrs. Eleanor Price, bustling in with a plate of scones, her cheeks flushed from the walk. A stout woman in her 50s, she wore an apron over her floral dress, her pride as the village baker evident in her upright posture. "For the dear Colonel's memory," she said stiffly, setting the plate down. "Though he didn't care for my baking, it seems." Her tone held a trace of bitterness, and Miss Marple recalled Dolly's account of the Colonel's harsh critique. "Thank you, Eleanor," Miss Marple said, her voice warm. "Your scones are always a highlight of the..." Everyone seated, the tea tray a centerpiece of civility. Miss Marple steered the conversation with the skill of a conductor. "Such a dreadful shock," she began, her needles clicking as she resumed her knitting. "Dolly, you mentioned Arthur's silver sugar bowl. An heirloom from India, wasn't it? He was so fond of it." Dolly, seated beside her, nodded tearfully. "Oh, yes. He brought it back from Calcutta, a gift from some prince. He used it every day for his tea." "Did he mention anything odd about it?" Miss Marple asked, her tone casual. "You said it went missing briefly." Dolly frowned. "Yes, last week, during the fete preparations. He found it in the garden shed of all places. He was quite cross, thinking someone had taken it." Raymond leaned forward, his pen poised. "A thief, perhaps. Or someone playing a prank." I told him at the time it sounded suspicious. Mrs. Price's cup rattled in its saucer. "I saw him polishing it at the fete stall," she said, her voice sharp. "It was on display, drawing quite a crowd. Odd that it vanished afterward." Vicar Clement cleared his throat, his fingers twisting a napkin. "He lent it to me briefly for a church exhibit, part of a historical display. But I returned it the next day, I assure you." Mr. Finch adjusted his tie, his eyes narrowing. "The Colonel's will makes no mention of the bowl. It's not listed among his assets." Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze moving from one face to another. Raymond's fidgeting, Mrs. Price's flush, the vicar's unease, Finch's defensiveness. Each reaction was a thread in the tapestry. "How curious," she said lightly. "A valuable item, misplaced and returned. And yet, the poison was in the sugar, or so the inspector believes." Dolly gasped. "But Elsie swore the sugar was fresh from the grocer." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, offering more tea. "But small details matter. Who was near the study that morning? Or perhaps earlier?" Gaze lingered on the roses outside, while Finch checked his watch repeatedly, eager to leave. When the guests departed, Miss Marple accompanied them to the gate, her eyes catching a glint in the gravel. A single crimson rose petal, identical to the one she'd found yesterday. She stooped to pick it up, her fingers brushing the earth. "Another," she murmured, tucking it beside the first in her pocket. The petal, vibrant against the gray stones, seemed out of place, as if dropped in haste or oversight. Back in her parlor, she sat by the fire, her knitting resumed but her mind racing. The sugar bowl, the petal, the visitors. Each was a piece of the puzzle. Raymond's talk of poison was too neat, a literary flourish or a deliberate misdirection. Mrs. Price's temper suggested a motive, but was it strong enough for murder? The vicar's greenhouse, with its exotic plants, might harbor more than roses. Arsenic was a common pesticide after all. And Finch, with his knowledge of the will, held secrets that might unravel everything. She recalled a similar incident years ago, when a misplaced trinket had revealed a thief's intent. The sugar bowl's brief disappearance was no accident, she suspected. Someone had handled it, perhaps tampered with it, during its time in the shed. But who had access, and why? As the church bells chimed 4, Miss Marple glanced out the window. Sparrowfield Lane was quiet now, the constable gone. But the mystery lingered like a mist. The fete would bring the village together tomorrow, a chance to observe her suspects in their element. For now, she poured herself another cup of tea, her mind weaving the threads of human nature into a pattern only she could see. The rose petals, the bowl, the bitter tea. They were whispers of truth waiting to be heard. And Miss Marple, with her quiet patience, was listening. Chapter 4. The Fete's Forgotten Shadows. The morning of the St. Mary Mead village fete dawned bright and crisp, with a sky as clear, a steady rhythm, as she moved from stall to stall. To the villagers, she was merely a kindly spinster, pausing to admire a jar of homemade jam or to compliment a child's painted rock. But her blue eyes, sharp as cut glass, missed nothing. The nervous glance of a stallholder, the hurried whisper between neighbors, the way a hand lingered too long near a display. She carried the 2 rose petals from Sparrowfield Lane in her pocket, their crimson hue a quiet reminder of the mystery that had taken root in her mind. The fete, despite the tragedy, had drawn the entire village, and with it, the 4 individuals who had visited the Bantry cottage on the morning of the colonel's death. Miss Marple's plan was simple. Observe them in their natural setting, where the bustle of the fete might loosen tongues and reveal truths hidden behind polite facades. People are careless when distracted, she mused, pausing at a stall selling knitted scarves not unlike her own. And a fete is nothing if not distracting. Her first stop was the cake stall, where Mrs. Eleanor Price presided with the authority of a general. Her table groaned under the weight of scones, Victoria sponges, and lemon drizzles, each labeled with a flourish of her neat handwriting. A blue ribbon, won in a previous year, hung proudly above, though Miss Marple noted a slight frown creasing Mrs. Price's brow as she served a customer. The baker's pride had been wounded by the colonel's critique, and today, with the competition looming, her temper seemed barely contained. "Good morning, Eleanor," Miss Marple said, selecting a scone and placing a coin in the tin. "Your baking is the talk of the fete, as always. Such a pity Arthur isn't here to see it." Mrs. Price's lips tightened. He never cared for my scones, Miss Marple. Called them dry, if you can believe it. I've half a mind to prove him wrong with this year's batch. She gestured to a tray of golden scones, their tops glistening with sugar. I've added a special touch. Cinnamon, my secret. Miss Marple smiled, noting the defensiveness in her tone. A secret ingredient can make all modest greenhouse display drawing murmurs of approval. His roses, though fine, paled beside the kernels, which had been entered posthumously by Dolly Bantry. The vicar, in his clerical black, fussed over a hybrid bloom, his hands dusted with soil. Miss Marple approached, her knitting needles clicking softly in her bag. "Mr. Clement, your roses are a credit to the village," she said, peering at a delicate pink bloom, "though I dare say Arthur's always stole the show. He mentioned sharing a fertilizer secret with you, didn't he?" The vicar's smile faltered, his fingers brushing a leaf. "He did promise, Miss Marple, but he never followed through. Said it was an old Indian recipe, something about ash and bone meal. I didn't press him. He could be so proprietary about his garden." His voice held a trace of frustration, quickly masked by a pious nod. "A terrible loss, the Colonel. I've been praying for clarity." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Clarity is a fine thing," she said. "Like noticing a petal out of place, or a bowl misplaced in a shed." She watched him closely, noting the slight tightening of his jaw. "You borrowed that sugar bowl for the church display, didn't you?" "Yes, briefly," he said, his tone careful. "I returned it the next day. It was quite safe in my care." "Of course," Miss Marple said, moving on but storing the vicar's unease in her mental ledger. His greenhouse, with its array of chemicals, could easily conceal a vial of arsenic, common in pest control. She knew from her own gardening days. But would a man of the cloth stoop to murder over a gardening rivalry? As she wandered toward the maypole, she spotted Raymond West, her nephew, entertaining a group of children with exaggerated tales of his latest novel. His animated gestures and booming laugh drew smiles. But Miss Marple noted a restlessness in his movements, as if he were eager to escape scrutiny. She approached, her smile fond but her questions sharp. "Raymond, dear, you're quite the storyteller today," she said, adjusting her hat. "Your visit with the Colonel—" "We found arsenic in the sugar bowl. The lab confirmed it this morning. Elsie, the maid, handled it last, so she's our prime suspect." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "Dear me, Inspector. That seems rather obvious, don't you think? Elsie's been with the Bantrys for years, hardly the sort to poison her employer over a trifle." Slack bristled. "Obvious or not, the evidence points to her. Fingerprints on the bowl, access to the tea tray. We're bringing her in for questioning." At that moment, Elsie herself appeared, hurrying across the green with a basket of FET programs. Her young face was pale, her eyes brimming with tears. "Miss Marple, I swear I didn't do it," she cried, clutching the basket. "I filled the bowl with sugar from Mr. Hodges' shop, same as always. I'd never hurt the Colonel." Miss Marple patted her arm, her voice soothing. There, Elsie. The truth has a way of surfacing, like a seed in spring. Tell me, did you notice anything odd about the bowl when you filled it?" Elsie shook her head. "It was just as usual, miss. Shiny and heavy like always. The Colonel was so particular about it." As Elsie hurried off, tailed by a constable, Miss Marple's mind turned over the facts. The sugar bowl with its arsenic-laced contents was the key, but its brief disappearance last week nagged at her. Had someone tampered with it during the fete preparations? And why the rose petals, scattered like breadcrumbs on Sparrowfield Lane? She paused by the Colonel's rose exhibit where Dolly Bantry stood, her eyes misty as she adjusted a bloom. "Jane, it's so hard," she said. "Arthur loved these roses. To think someone used his own sugar bowl against him." Miss Marple squeezed her friend's hand. "We'll find the truth, Dolly. But tell me, who else was near the fete stall when the bowl was on display?" Dolly frowned, thinking. "Everyone, really. Raymond helped set up the tables. Mrs. Price was fussing over her cakes. The vicar was arranging his church display, and Mr. Finch was there, going over the fete accounts with Arthur. It was chaos." Miss Marple petals in her pocket. They were a clue, she was certain. But to what? The answer lay in the ordinary, in the everyday moments of St. Mary Mead, and she would find it, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 5. Letters from the Past. The afternoon sun slanted across St. Mary Mead, casting elongated shadows over Sparrowfield Lane as the fete wound down. The vicarage lawn, once a riot of color and laughter, now bore the remnants of the day's festivities. Scattered ribbons trampled underfoot, empty cake stands, and wilted flowers drooping in the heat. Villagers lingered in small clusters, their voices hushed with the weight of unspoken suspicions. The arrest of Elsie the maid had rippled through the community like a stone dropped in a pond, stirring murmurs of doubt and defense. "Poor girl," some said. "She couldn't hurt a fly." Others nodded sagely. You never know what's in a person's heart. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag heavy with unspoken thoughts, made her way back to her cottage. The rose petals in her pocket seemed to press against her thigh, a tactile reminder of the puzzle at hand. She had observed much at the fete. The suspect's fleeting expressions, Inspector Slack's hasty conclusions. But facts were needed, not mere impressions. Human nature, she reflected, was like a garden, beautiful on the surface, but requiring careful digging to uncover the weeds beneath. Settling into her armchair by the window, Miss Marple drew out the petals, laying them on a lace doily, crimson, velvety, with a faint thorn scar on one edge. They matched the Colonel's prize hybrids perfectly. Dropped accidentally or deliberately? She turned her attention to a bundle Dolly Bantry had pressed upon her earlier. A stack of the Colonel's papers, rescued from his desk before the police sealed the study. "Jane, you might see something we missed," Dolly had whispered, her eyes pleading. The papers were mundane at first glance. Gardening notes, fete programs, a receipt for rose fertilizer. Was quieter now. The Bantry cottage shuttered and somber, a constable's silhouette visible through the window. Finch's office was a narrow building squeezed between the bakery and the post office, its brass plaque gleaming dully in the fading light. The solicitor, a gaunt man in his 50s with wire-rimmed spectacles and a perpetual air of confidentiality, looked up from his desk as Miss Marple entered. Papers were strewn about, ledgers open to accounts that spoke of village fortunes and foibles. "Miss Marple," he said, rising with a stiff bow. "To what do I owe this pleasure? If it's about the Colonel's estate, I'm afraid matters are with the police." She settled into a chair opposite him, her eyes kind but penetrating. "Precisely why I'm here, Mr. Finch. Dolly entrusted me with some papers, and this letter caught my eye." She placed it on the desk, watching his reaction, a flicker of unease, quickly masked. Finch adjusted his spectacles, scanning the page. "Ah, yes. The Colonel was adamant about changes. He planned to cut off young Mr. West, citing his lifestyle. I advised against haste, but Arthur was stubborn. Disinheriting a relative is no small matter, Miss Marple said mildly, her needles emerging from her bag as if to knit away the tension. Raymond would have been notified eventually. Did the Colonel mention debts, perhaps, or something more? Finch leaned back, his fingers steepled. Confidential, you understand. But since the Colonel's gone... Yes, Raymond had borrowed from him, several times. Arthur discovered he'd been using the money for dubious investments, some literary scheme gone awry. He was furious, threatened to expose it all. Miss Marple nodded, her mind connecting threads. Raymond's fidgeting at tea, his literary talk of poisons. Distraction, or deeper guilt. And the sugar bowl? Was it mentioned in the will? Finch shook his head. Not specifically. It's a personal item, would go to Dolly. But during our meeting, Arthur mentioned it had been misplaced again. She replied, stepping inside amid the scent of earth and blooms. Shelves groaned with pots, tools, and bottles labeled in Latin. A row of exotic plants thrived under his care. Orchids from seed, hybrids he'd coaxed to life. Your greenhouse is a marvel, Mr. Clement. The Colonel envied it, I suspect. He promised you his fertilizer recipe, didn't he? The vicar flushed, pruning a leaf with unnecessary vigor. He did, but never shared. Said it was a family secret from India. Ash, minerals, a touch of something potent. I use arsenic-based pesticides myself, you know, for the aphids. Perfectly safe in small doses, diluted properly. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on a shelf. Vials of powders, a mortar and pestle, gloves stained green. Arsenic, common in gardens, deadly in tea. Safe indeed, she murmured. But misplaced items can be dangerous. Like the sugar bowl you borrowed. I returned it promptly, he insisted, his voice rising slightly. Though, I did see Mrs. Price near the Bantry shed the evening before, carrying a basket, looking furtive. A red herring, or truth? Miss Marple thanked him and left, the greenhouse door creaking shut behind her. The churchyard was peaceful, gravestones mossy and ancient, but her thoughts were on the living. Mrs. Price seen lurking. Jealousy over scones, or something darker? As dusk fell, Miss Marple paused at the Bantry gate, where a neighbor, old Mrs. Harrow, was pruning hedges. Evening, miss, she said. Dreadful business. But I saw Mrs. Price here the night before the murder, basket in hand. Said she was returning a borrowed tray. But it was odd, after dark. Miss Marple nodded, her mind whirring. The basket, the bowl, the poison. Pieces aligning, yet not quite fitting. Back in her cottage, she fire. The rose petals on the table. Mrs. Price's nocturnal visit. The vicar's arsenic. Finch's secrets. Raymond's debts. They swirled like leaves in the wind. But the truth was there, hidden in the past's letters and the garden's shadows. She would unravel it, stitch by careful stitch. Chapter 6. Tangled Threads. The twilight of St. Mary Mead settled over Sparrowfield Lane like a soft shawl, muting the vibrant hues of autumn into shades of indigo and gray. The village, still reeling from the fate and the shock of Elsie's brief arrest, seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the next revelation to shatter its fragile calm. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her garden under the glow of a lantern, knitted with steady hands, her needles clicking like a metronome. The rose petals, now 3 in number after another was found near the Bantry gate, lay on a saucer beside her, their crimson edges curling slightly in the evening chill. To her, they were more than mere debris. They were threads in a tapestry of deceit, each one pointing to a truth buried beneath the village's polished surface. Her mind, as sharp as the thorns on Colonel Bantry's prized roses, wove together the clues gathered thus far. The silver sugar bowl, laced with arsenic, had returned to the forefront of her thoughts. Its brief disappearance during the fete preparations, its reappearance in the shed, and now the faint scratch on its rim, all suggested a deliberate act, not a careless misplacement. The letter threatening to disinherit Raymond, her nephew, hinted at financial motives, but his nervous laughter and literary flair made him seem more hapless than malevolent. Mrs. Price's late-night visit to the Bantry property, as reported by Mrs. Harrow, raised questions of jealousy, or perhaps a deeper grudge. Vicar Clement's greenhouse, with its vials of arsenic-based pesticide, offered a plausible source for the poison, though his mild demeanor seemed at odds with murder. And Mr. Finch, the solicitor, guarded secrets about the Colonel's will that might have been. Miss Marple, her knitting bag at her side, moved among them, her presence as unassuming as a shadow. She approached Mrs. Price first, noting the baker's brisk movements and the faint scowl that lingered on her face. "Eleanor, your stall was a triumph," Miss Marple said, her voice warm. "I heard you were at the Bantry cottage the evening before the tragedy. Returning a tray, was it?" Mrs. Price's hands stilled, a jar of raspberry jam trembling slightly. "Mrs. Harrow's been gossiping, has she?" she said, her tone sharp. "Yes, I returned a tray I'd borrowed for the fete. Nothing more. I was in and out in a moment. Dolly was there, fussing over decorations." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes catching the flush on Mrs. Price's cheeks. "And the sugar bowl? Did you see it that evening?" "Not a glimpse," Mrs. Price snapped. "I had no business with Arthur's precious heirlooms. If you ask me, that maid Elsie should be looked at closer, always hovering about." Miss Marple smiled gently, letting the deflection pass. Mrs. Price's temper was a thread worth tugging, but not yet. She moved to the vicar, who was stacking hymnals with a distracted air. His hands, still dusted with soil, suggested a recent visit to his greenhouse. "Mr. Clement, your roses were much admired," she said, settling beside him. "I've been thinking about the Colonel's garden. You mentioned his fertilizer. A secret recipe, wasn't it? Could it have included something potent, like arsenic?" The vicar's fingers fumbled a book which thudded to the table. "Arsenic? Oh no, Miss Marple. His recipe was all natural, or so he claimed. Ash, bone meal, that sort of thing. My own pesticides use arsenic, but they're locked away. I'd never." His voice trailed off, his eyes darting to the window. "Of course," Miss Marple said soothingly. "But you were near the bantry shed that week, weren't you?" Laugh was brittle. He was always grumbling. "I borrowed a bit, sure, but I'd never kill for it. I'm a writer, not a villain." She let him go, her mind cataloging his defensiveness. Raymond's alibi was shaky, his purchase of poison a troubling coincidence. But murder required more than opportunity. It required intent, and she wasn't convinced he had it. As she left the hall, Inspector Slack intercepted her, his notebook brimming with scribbles. "Miss Marple, we're at a dead end," he admitted, his usual bluster softened by frustration. "Elsie's fingerprints are on the bowl, but so are half the village's, it seems. The sugar was tainted, but how it got there—" He shook his head. "Any of your theories panning out?" "Theories are like knitting patterns, Inspector," she replied, her needles clicking as she walked. "They only work if you follow the right thread. Have you looked into the bowl's movements before the murder?" Slack frowned. "It was in the shed, then back in the study. We're checking who had access, but it's a mess. Fet workers were in and out." Miss Marple nodded, her mind returning to the shed. It was the pivot point, the place where the bowl had been misplaced. She resolved to visit it herself, but first a detour to Dolly Bantry's cottage to clarify a detail. Dolly was in her drawing room, sorting through condolence letters with a weary expression. "Jane, you're a godsend," she said, offering tea. "This house feels so empty without Arthur." Miss Marple accepted a cup, her eyes scanning the room for clues. "Dolly, the night Mrs. Price returned the tray, did you see her near the shed, or perhaps the study?" Dolly frowned, stirring her tea. "I didn't see her in the shed, but she was near the back door by the rose garden. She said the tray was for fete cakes, but she seemed in a hurry to leave." Another thread, frayed but significant. Miss Marple thanked her and made her way to the Bantry garden, where the shed stood at the edge of the rose beds. It was a small weathered structure, cluttered with tools, pots, and sacks of fertilizer. She stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The air smelled of— Mixed it with sugar and placed it in the bowl. The threads were tangling. Mrs. Price's nocturnal visit, the vicar's chemicals, Raymond's debts, Finch's secrets. Inspector Slack, meanwhile, was chasing shadows, convinced the maid was still the key. Miss Marple knew better. The truth lay in the ordinary. A petal, a bowl, a letter. She recalled a case from years ago when a misplaced key had unlocked a murder. This time, the key was metaphorical, but no less vital. As the church bells chimed 7, she tucked the receipt into her knitting bag alongside the petals. Tomorrow she would press harder, pulling at the loose ends until the knot unraveled. For now, Sparrowfield Lane slept, its secrets buried but not beyond her reach. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, each stitch a step closer to the truth. Chapter 7. A Glimmer in the Garden. The dawn broke over St. Mary Mead with a gentle mist, cloaking Sparrowfield Lane in a veil of silver that softened the edges of its cottages and gardens. The village, though still shaken by Colonel Bantry's murder, carried on with the quiet resilience of a community accustomed to weathering storms. The church bells tolled softly, and the scent of dew-kissed roses mingled with the faint smoke of early fires. Miss Jane Marple, ever an early riser, stood in her garden, her shawl draped over her shoulders as she surveyed the lane. Her knitting bag slung over her arm held the 3 crimson rose petals, the pesticide receipt, and her growing suspicions, each a thread in the intricate pattern she was weaving. The investigation had reached a turning point. The sugar bowl, laced with arsenic, remained the fulcrum of the mystery. Its brief disappearance and reappearance in the Bantry shed a puzzle within a puzzle. Mrs. Price's nocturnal visit, Vicar Clement's greenhouse chemicals, Raymond West's debts, and Mr. Finch's guarded demeanor. The tin-marked sugar, noted yesterday, sat undisturbed, but Miss Marple's eyes fell on a small bottle tucked behind a sack of fertilizer. Labeled arsenic-based pesticide, it was half empty, its cap slightly askew. She didn't touch it, knowing Inspector Slack's men would need to examine it, but the discovery sent her thoughts racing. The Colonel had purchased such a pesticide, per the receipt. But had it been used here, or elsewhere? Her next stop was the vicarage, where Vicar Clement was tending his greenhouse, his hands buried in a pot of soil. The glass structure hummed with warmth, its shelves lined with exotic plants and neatly labeled bottles. The vicar looked up, his mild eyes clouded with unease. "Miss Marple, you're out early," he said, brushing dirt from his cassock. "More questions about the roses?" "Roses, yes, but also their care," she replied, her tone gentle but probing. "I noticed some of the Colonel's blooms are wilted, quite unlike yours which thrive. You use arsenic for pests, don't you?" He nodded, his fingers tightening on a trowel. "In small doses, diluted. It's standard for aphids. But I haven't used it recently, not since the fete preparations, when I was in and out of the Bantry shed." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on a bottle identical to the one in the shed, its label faded but legible. "This bottle looks well used," she said, pointing. "When did you last open it?" The vicar flushed, setting the trowel down. "Weeks ago, I assure you. If you're suggesting I took it to the Bantry shed—" "Not at all," she interrupted, her smile disarming. "But sheds are busy places during a fete. Anyone could have borrowed a bottle, or mistaken it for something else." As she left, the vicar's unease lingered in her mind. His greenhouse was a treasure trove of possibilities, but his nervousness seemed born of fear, not guilt. She recalled a case from her youth, when a gardener's carelessness had led to a deadly mix-up. Was this similar? Or more? And who was involved? Finch hesitated, then leaned forward. He didn't name names, but he mentioned seeing a familiar face near his shed the night before his death. He thought it was connected. Miss Marple's mind seized the detail. A familiar face, a shed, a forged document, threads weaving tighter. And the sugar bowl, was it part of this? "Not directly," Finch said, but he was obsessive about it. Kept saying it had been tampered with. I thought he was paranoid. Thanking him, Miss Marple stepped into the square where the bakery was opening its shutters. Mrs. Price, her apron dusted with flour, was arranging scones in the window. Miss Marple paused, her eyes catching a flicker of movement. A child dropping a petal near the door, identical to the ones in her pocket. She approached, her voice kind. "Eleanor, you've been so busy," she said. "That night you returned the tray to Dolly. Did you see anyone near the shed? Or perhaps the sugar bowl?" Mrs. Price's hands stilled, her face reddening. "I told you I was only there a moment. I didn't see anything or anyone." "Why do you keep asking?" "Just tidying loose ends," Miss Marple replied, her smile unwavering. "Like petals scattered on a path. As she walked away, she heard Mrs. Price mutter under her breath something about nosy spinsters. The baker's defensiveness was a thread worth tugging, but Miss Marple needed more. She returned to Sparrowfield Lane, where Raymond West was lounging on a bench, his notebook open but his pen idle. "Raymond, dear," she said, settling beside him. "Your stories about poison. Were they practice, perhaps? A way to test a theory?" He paled, his fingers clutching the notebook. "Aunt Jane, you're impossible. It was fiction, nothing more. I didn't touch that bowl, and I certainly didn't poison anyone. I was in debt, yes, but I'd never—" "Never is a strong word," she interrupted gently. "The Colonel was cutting you off. That must have stung." "It did," he admitted, his voice low. "But I'm no murderer. I was at the inn that night, writing. Ask the barmaid. Miss Marple." "That got to do with anything?" "Everything, Inspector," she replied, her needles clicking. "A scratch can mean tampering, just as a petal can mean intent. Look at the Colonel's habits. Did he always use the same spoon?" Slack's eyes widened. "The silver spoon from India. He stirred his tea with it every morning. We didn't test it, assumed the poison was in the sugar." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Assumptions are like dropped stitches, Inspector. They unravel the work." As he left to order new tests, Miss Marple sat by her fire, the petals and receipt before her. The wilted roses, the half-empty pesticide bottle, the forged document, the scattered petals. They pointed to a deliberate act, not a careless one. Someone had known the Colonel's habits, had access to the shed, and had motive to silence him. The suspects were narrowing, but the truth was still a shadow in the garden. She recalled a case from years ago, when a tampered heirloom had revealed a killer's hand. The sugar bowl, or perhaps the spoon, was the key. But who had held it last? As the church bells chimed noon, Miss Marple tucked the clues into her bag, her resolve firm. The glimmer in the garden was growing brighter, and she would follow it to the truth. Chapter 8. Unraveling the Knot. The late morning sun bathed St. Mary Mead in a golden glow, softening the edges of Sparrowfield Lane's cobblestones and coaxing a faint warmth from the autumn air. The village, though still shadowed by Colonel Bantry's murder, carried on with its daily rhythms. The milkman's cart rattled past, children played in the churchyard, and the scent of roses lingered, a bittersweet reminder of the tragedy. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her parlor with a cup of Darjeeling, felt the threads of the mystery tightening in her mind. Her knitting needles clicked steadily, each stitch mirroring her methodical piecing together of clues. The 4 rose petals, the pesticide receipt, the wilted roses, and the scratched silver sugar bowl were no longer scattered fragments but parts of a pattern, ready to be woven into a coherent whole. The breakthrough in the garden shed, the half-empty bottle of arsenic, loose thread. Miss Marple set out for Mrs. Price's bakery, where the morning rush had subsided, leaving the air heavy with the scent of fresh bread and cinnamon. The baker was behind the counter, her hands dusted with flour as she arranged a tray of scones. Her face, usually flushed with purpose, bore a trace of wariness as Miss Marple entered, her walking stick tapping softly. "Good morning, Eleanor," Miss Marple said, her voice as warm as the bakery's oven. "Your scones are drawing quite a crowd for the fet's leftovers. I've been thinking about that night you returned the tray to Dolly. You were near the rose garden, weren't you?" Mrs. Price's hands stilled, her eyes narrowing. "Miss Marple, you've asked me this before. I told you. I was there for a moment. Returning a tray, nothing more. I didn't go near that shed or the Colonel's precious bowl." Her tone was sharp, but a tremor betrayed her unease. "Of course," Miss Marple said, selecting a scone and placing a coin on the counter. But gardens are such tempting places, aren't they? All those roses and perhaps a glimpse of something misplaced, like a bottle of pesticide. Mrs. Price's face reddened. If you're accusing me, I'll have you know I keep my own pest control. Nothing fancy, just traps and such. I found traces of arsenic in my storeroom once, from an old bag of flour, but I threw it out. I'd never touch the Colonel's things. Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. Arsenic in your storeroom. How curious. From the grocer, perhaps? No, it was years old, left by the previous tenant, Mrs. Price said quickly, wiping her hands on her apron. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've customers. Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloging the detail. Arsenic in the bakery, however old, was a thread worth noting. She thanked Mrs. Price and stepped outside where the village square buzzed with activity. A child dropped a rose petal near the bakery door. Another crimson clue, identical to the others. She stooped to retrieve it, adding it to her collection, the shelf where the bottle sat. But during the fete, with all the comings and goings, someone might have borrowed it. The bantry shed, for instance. Busy place, wasn't it? He nodded reluctantly. I was there, helping with stalls. But I didn't take anything, I swear. Though, I did see Mr. Finch near the shed one evening, looking rather furtive. Miss Marple's needles paused in her bag. Furtive, you say? How interesting. She thanked him and left, the vicar's words adding another stitch to her pattern. Finch, always so guarded, was emerging as a key figure. She found the solicitor at his office, his desk buried under ledgers and legal documents. Mr. Finch looked up, his spectacles glinting with irritation. Miss Marple, I'm swamped, he said, his voice clipped. If this is about the Colonel's will— It's about truth, Mr. Finch, she interrupted, her tone mild but firm. You mentioned a forged document, a loan the Colonel believed was settled. Did he suspect anyone specific? Finch sighed, removing his spectacles. He was convinced it was someone close, someone who knew his finances. He mentioned seeing Raymond West near his study the week before, going through papers. Arthur thought he was snooping. Miss Marple's lips pursed. And the sugar bowl? He thought it had been tampered with, didn't he? Yes, Finch admitted. He kept saying it felt different, heavier perhaps. I told him it was nonsense, but he insisted someone had touched it. The detail was a spark in Miss Marple's mind. A heavier bowl, a scratched rim. Had it been altered? Perhaps lined with something deadly? She thanked Finch and stepped into the square where Raymond West was sketching by the fountain, his notebook filled with doodles of roses and daggers. Raymond, dear, she said, settling beside him. You've been candid about your debts, but not about your actions. Were you in the Colonel's study looking at papers? His pencil snapped, his face paling. Aunt Jane, you're relentless. Yes, I glanced at some papers. Research loved its weight. Said it stirred the sugar just right. Miss Marple's mind seized the detail. The spoon, not the bowl, might be the key. A coating of arsenic, perhaps, applied to its surface. She recalled a case from her youth where a tampered utensil had turned a routine habit deadly. As evening fell, she visited Inspector Slack at the police station, where he was poring over reports. Miss Marple, you're everywhere, he grumbled, but his tone held a grudging respect. We tested the spoon. Traces of arsenic, just as you suspected. Not enough to kill outright, but over time, or with a final dose. A clever method, she said, her needles clicking. Someone knew his habits. "Have you rechecked the shed for fingerprints?" "Plenty, but none clear," he said. "The bowl, the tin, the pesticide bottle, all handled by half the village during the fete." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. The suspects were narrowing: Mrs. Price's arsenic traces, the vicar's bottle, Finch's forgery, Raymond's snooping. But the motive was still a shadow. The petals, though, were a trail she couldn't ignore. She recalled seeing one near the bakery, another by the vicarage, and now a sixth on the lane. Were they deliberate or a gardener's carelessness? Back at her cottage, she laid out the petals, their crimson vivid against the lace doily. The receipt, the wilted roses, the scratched bowl, the tainted spoon. They formed a pattern, but one piece was missing. She recalled a conversation at the fete. The colonel had argued with someone about church funds, a detail Vicar Clement had downplayed. Had it been more than a disagreement? As the church bells chimed 9, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting a steady rhythm. The knot was loosening, the threads aligning. Tomorrow she would gather the suspects for a final reckoning, pulling the loose end until the truth unraveled. For now, Sparrowfield Lane slept, its secrets closer to the surface than ever before. Chapter 9. The Revelation at Dusk. As dusk settled over and Mr. Harold Finch and Inspector Slack, under the pretense of discussing the colonel's memorial. The drawing room, with its chintz curtains and crackling fire, was a haven of warmth, but the air was thick with anticipation. Miss Marple, seated in a high-backed chair, her lavender shawl draped over her shoulders, exuded an air of quiet authority. Her knitting lay idle in her lap, a silent partner to her thoughts, as she surveyed the assembled group. Dolly, pale and tearful, poured tea with trembling hands. Raymond fidgeted with his pen, his usual bravado subdued. Mrs. Price, her apron exchanged for a stiff dress, sat with crossed arms, her face a mask of defiance. Vicar Clement, his clerical collar pristine, clasped a prayer book, his eyes darting nervously. Mr. Finch, briefcase at his side, maintained his usual guarded demeanor, though his fingers drummed on the armrest. Inspector Slack stood by the door, notebook in hand, his brow furrowed with skepticism, but a flicker of curiosity in his gaze. "Dear friends," Miss Marple began, her voice gentle but carrying the weight of certainty. "We are here to honor Colonel Bantry, but also to seek justice for his untimely death. A murder in St. Mary Mead is a wound to us all, and the truth, like a rose, must be carefully tended to bloom. Let us piece together what happened." She paused, letting the silence settle, her eyes moving from face to face. The poison, as we know, was arsenic, found in the sugar bowl and traced on the colonel's silver spoon from India. But the bowl's brief disappearance during the fete, the scratch on its rim, and the wilted roses in his garden tell a deeper story. Someone here knew Arthur's habits, his love for that spoon, his ritual of stirring his tea, and used them to deadly effect. Raymond shifted uncomfortably, his pen tapping. "Aunt Jane, you're making this sound like one of my novels. I told you my talk of poisons was just fiction." Miss Marple's smile was kind but unyielding, tightened on his prayer book, his voice trembling. "I returned the bowl, and my pesticides are locked away. I'd never harm a soul, Miss Marple, you know that." She nodded, her eyes shifting to Finch. Mr. Finch, the colonel suspected a forged document, a loan he believed settled. You were seen near his shed, and he thought his sugar bowl had been tampered with. Secrets, as you know, can breed desperation. Finch's spectacles glinted as he leaned forward. I handled his affairs, nothing more. The forgery was his suspicion, not mine. As for the shed, I was checking Fed accounts, not sneaking about. Miss Marple raised a hand, her voice steady. Each of you had opportunity and perhaps motive. But let us consider the clues. The sugar bowl was laced with arsenic, but the spoon, used daily by Arthur, bore traces too, suggesting a clever method, a coating, perhaps, applied to its surface, activated by the heat of the tea. The bowl's scratch hints at tampering, and its disappearance during the fete gave someone access. The rose petals, scattered across the lane, were not accidents. They marked a trail, dropped by someone moving to and from the shed. She reached into her pocket, producing the 6 petals, their crimson vivid against her palm. These came from Arthur's roses found near the cottage, the bakery, the vicarage, even the square. Someone was careless or deliberate. The room grew still, the fire's crackle the only sound. Dolly's cup rattled in its saucer. Jane, who could do such a thing? She whispered. Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her words were firm. Mrs. Price, you polished the sugar bowl at the fete stall, didn't you? A kind gesture, but it gave you access. The arsenic in your storeroom, old or not, was a coincidence too neat to ignore. Yet your temper, though fierce, lacks the patience for such a plan. Mrs. Price exhaled, her shoulders sagging. Marple turned to Dolly, her voice softening. Dolly, my dear, you've borne this loss with grace, but there's one detail you didn't share. Arthur's letters, found in his desk, mentioned an old flame from India, a woman he never forgot. You read them, didn't you? And you knew he was planning to leave you a portion of his estate to honor her memory. Dolly's face crumpled, her handkerchief pressed to her lips. Jane, how could you? The spoon, Miss Marple said gently. You knew Arthur's habit of stirring his tea vigorously, the one item he used daily. During his nap, while Elsie was out, you coated it with arsenic from the shed's pesticide, taken during the fete chaos. The petals fell as you moved between the shed and the house, marking your path. You loved him, but jealousy and fear of losing him to a ghost drove you to it. Dolly broke into sobs, her voice a whisper. He was going to give her everything, his love, his legacy. I couldn't bear it, Jane. I only meant to make him ill, to keep him here, but it went too far. Inspector Slack stepped forward, his notebook forgotten, his face stunned. Mrs. Bantry, you're saying she— Yes, Inspector, Miss Marple said, her tone heavy with sorrow. The truth is often the hardest to see, hidden in the heart of those we trust. Dolly's sobs filled the room as Slack gently took her arm, leading her out. The others sat in stunned silence, their faces a mix of shock and relief. Raymond stared at his aunt, awestruck. Aunt Jane, how did you know? Human nature, dear, she said softly. It's always the same, whether in a village or a palace. As the constable arrived to assist, Miss Marple gathered her knitting, the petals now a solved riddle. The drawing room, once a haven, felt empty, its warmth dimmed by betrayal. Outside, Sparrowfield Lane lay quiet, its secrets laid bare under the gathering dusk. Chapter 10. Tea and Tranquility. The morning sun rose gently over St. Mary Mead, casting a soft, forgiving light. Harold Finch, his secrets no longer a burden. And Inspector Slack, whose grudging respect for Miss Marple had blossomed into something akin to admiration. The parlor, with its lace doilies, chintz cushions, and a vase of late-blooming roses, exuded warmth, a stark contrast to the chill of the previous evening's confrontation. A fire crackled in the hearth, and the air carried the comforting scent of lavender and freshly brewed Darjeeling. Miss Marple, her white hair tucked beneath a lavender scarf, arranged a tray of porcelain cups with deliberate care. Her blue eyes, sharp yet kind, surveyed the room as her guests arrived, each carrying the weight of recent days. The village, she knew, needed closure, and her explanation, delivered over tea, would help mend the torn fabric of St. Mary Mead. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice as gentle as the morning light filtering through the lace curtains. "After such a trying time, it's only right we gather to understand what happened to poor Arthur Bantry. The truth, like a garden, requires tending, and I hope to offer clarity today." She poured tea, her hands steady, as her guests settled into chairs. Raymond, his usual exuberance muted, clutched a notebook, his pen still. Mrs. Price, her apron replaced by a neat dress, sat with folded hands, her face softer than usual. Vicar Clement, his prayer book tucked away, offered a faint smile. Finch, his briefcase absent for once, adjusted his spectacles with a sigh. Inspector Slack, standing by the window, nodded for her to proceed. His notebook open, but his expression attentive. "The death of Colonel Bantry," Miss Marple continued, "was a shock to us all, a wound in the heart of our village. Arsenic, found in his silver sugar bowl and traced on his Indian spoon, was the method. But the motive lay deeper, in the quiet currents of human nature." She sipped her tea, letting the words settle. The sugar bowl, with its scratched rim, was the first clue. It had vanished during the fete, reappeared. Presence near the cottage that night raised questions. The arsenic in your storeroom, though old, was a coincidence that clouded the truth. You polished the sugar bowl at the fete, but innocently, to help. Mrs. Price nodded, her eyes misty. "I was angry, Miss Marple, but I'd never harm him. My scones are my legacy, not poison." "Quite so," Miss Marple said, her gaze moving to the vicar. "Mr. Clement, your greenhouse held the key, arsenic pesticide, easily accessible during the fete's chaos. Your unease came from protecting your flock, not guilt. Someone took your bottle, and the wilted roses showed where it was used." The vicar clasped his hands, his voice soft. "I feared I'd failed to secure it. Thank you for seeing the truth." Miss Marple nodded, turning to Finch. "Mr. Finch, the forged document and your furtive presence near the shed made you a suspect, but Arthur's suspicions were a red herring. Your caution was professional, not murderous." Finch adjusted his spectacles, a rare smile breaking through. "I'm relieved to be cleared, Miss Marple. The Colonel was a difficult client, but I valued him." Finally, she addressed Inspector Slack, who leaned forward, his skepticism softened. "Inspector, you followed the evidence, the fingerprints, the sugar bowl. But the obvious can mislead. The spoon, not the bowl, was the true weapon." Coated with arsenic, it poisoned Arthur gradually, activated by his vigorous stirring. The final dose, perhaps in the sugar, ensured his death. Slack shook his head, a wry grin forming. "You saw what I missed, Miss Marple. That spoon. I should have tested it sooner." "Human nature hides in habits," she said gently. Dolly knew Arthur's routine better than anyone. His letters found in his desk revealed an old flame from India, a woman he planned to honor with part of his estate. Jealousy and fear of losing him to a memory drove her to act. During his nap while Elsie was out, she coated the spoon with arsenic from the shed's pesticide, taken during the fete. The petals fell as Marple. "I'll see to the paperwork, but Dolly's confessed. She's with the magistrate now." Miss Marple's eyes softened with sorrow. She acted out of pain, not malice. May she find peace, and St. Mary Mead with her. As the guests sipped their tea, the conversation turned to lighter matters: the fete's success, the roses' resilience. The village, though scarred, would heal, its rhythms restored like a well-tended garden. Miss Marple offered scones, Mrs. Price's naturally, and the room filled with quiet chatter, a sign of mending hearts. Outside, Sparrowfield Lane lay serene, the roses blooming anew under neighborly care. The church bells chimed 9, a reminder of time's steady march. Miss Marple escorted her guests to the door, her knitting bag at her side, the pressed petals a silent memento of the case. "Human nature," she said to Raymond as he lingered, "is predictable, yet always surprising. Like a rose, it's beautiful and thorny." He grinned, his notebook tucked away. "I'm putting this in my next book, Aunt Jane. With your permission, of course." She laughed softly. "Write the truth, dear, but leave out the thorns." As the door closed, she returned to her parlor, the fire's glow warming the room. The mystery was solved, the knot unraveled, and St. Mary Mead would find its peace again. Miss Marple picked up her knitting, her needles resuming their rhythm. Each stitch a promise of tranquility restored.